Good morning, afternoon, or evening to everyone, depending on where you are. Welcome to the IEEE STEM Summit 2022. I am Lorena Garcia, Chair of the Pre-University Education Coordinating Committee, PECC, of IEEE Educational Activities. I'm very glad to see you all connected. This is our second version, and we have worked very hard to offer you a great event this year too. I'm very excited because we have more than 1,000 people registered this year, almost twice than in our first edition. And I'm sure many of you may be coming back from last year's summit. Thank you for trusting us. And for the new people, we hope we can inspire you to become part of this global community. As you know, the purpose of this space is for all of us, volunteers, educators, professionals, parents, anyone interested in promoting STEM at university levels to share our experiences and enrich our view, get new ideas, and keep improving or inventing new ways to reach out to the next generation of STEM professionals. To start, let me introduce Steve Phillips. Steve is our current Vice President of IEEE Educational Activities, who will welcome you to this event. Steve?
Thank you, Lorena. Welcome, everyone. I want to thank Lorena for leading this effort, and also Stamatis Dragomanos, who you'll hear from a little bit later, who was instrumental in getting this off the ground. Also, there are a number of IEEE Educational Activities staff members who contribute mightily to this effort: Donna Schultz, Lynn Bowlby, and Deborah Gulick in particular, for implementing the activity. Finally, I'd like to welcome all the participants and thank especially our very passionate speakers and panelists who've been involved in STEM all around the world. And we're confident that you will learn a lot from this event. And I look forward to hearing the speakers and panelists along with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve, for your kind words. For this week, we have a great agenda. Today, we will have our keynote presentation. During the week, we will have 7 sessions from our invited speakers. We will have 3 panel discussions with the participation of technical societies, the recipients of the IEEE President's Scholarships, and some of our STEM champions. This year, we will also have 3 networking sessions and a permanent expo. And finally, the cherry on the cake is the family fun session on Saturday, where all participants will have a hands-on experience going through one of the tri-engineering lesson plan. We hope you invite your kids and have a great morning together. Next, please. This year, the IEEE Foundation has created an IEEE Tri-Engineering Fund based on the impact that they have seen in all the STEM outreach that we are collectively doing as IEEE. Please consider donating to help us to provide free resources to educators, introduce students to the wonders of engineering, and help volunteers like you bring more STEM activities to your own communities all around the world. You can visit the IEEE Foundation webpage or the link that is available on the summit page. And thank you in advance for your support. Well, before we start, there is some housekeeping to do. All sessions will be recorded and available for viewing and reviewing later. If you want to ask questions during the presentations today, please post them into the chat on the right side of the event window. Remember to participate in the STEM Summit challenges to win prizes. The link can be found on the Summit's reception page, and the winners will be announced on Friday. Don't be left out of the STEM Summit conversations and participate during the whole week on our collaborative and Facebook communities. Please use the hashtag STEM Summit. And finally, make sure to get your participation certificate and badge from the Summit reception page. Well, now let's get started. It's my honor and pleasure to have as our main keynote today Dr. Ioannis Miaulis, President of the Roger Williams University, with his talk, Teaching and Learning Science, We've Got It All Wrong. That will be very interesting. Well, Dr. Miaulis is a visionary leader in experiential learning and champion of STEM education. As the 11th president of Roger Williams University, he will keep providing an outstanding education through community engaged learning and civic scholarship. He previously served as president and director of the Boston Museum of Science since 2003, introducing more than 1.5 million visitors a year to STEM. Dr. Miaulis led the development of the museum's National Center for Technological Literacy, advancing the knowledge of engineering and technology through K-12 curriculum programs that have reached an estimated 200,000 teachers and 18 million students. Dr. Ioannis, it's a pleasure to have you here. Thanks for accepting this invitation. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'll start by telling you a little bit about how this whole thing started. And it was back in I believe, 1988. My wife and I moved into our first house, which was in Stowe, Massachusetts. I had gotten my first job as assistant professor in the mechanical engineering department at Tufts University. And many of you may remember back then the superconducting materials that researchers in the IBM laboratories in Zurich had put together. There were ceramic materials that could become superconductive at liquid nitrogen temperatures. And many of you may remember the magic demonstration where you put the superconductor in liquid nitrogen and you could place a strong magnet on top of it and the magnet would float in the air like it's magic. Nonetheless, I had put together a research group primarily with undergraduate students, and we were trying to use techniques to recrystallize the materials in a thick film form to be used for electronic applications. So we could make the materials, was not that difficult, but then we're working more into figuring out how you can make thick films out of these materials. I didn't have any children back then. And as I said, we moved into our first house about the same time I was engaged in this research project. And I was driving from our house to the university. It was about 25 miles away. And I took the wrong turn and I ended up at the parking lot of the neighborhood middle school. As I was looping around to get out of the parking lot to get back into the road, I thought, these are cool materials that we are working with. Maybe the kids in the school would be interested in seeing them. So I got out of the car and walked into the school. There were no metal detectors back then. You could walk straight into the school, to the principal's office. And I talked to the principal, who was very excited. I told him I'm a new professor at Tufts University. This is what I'm working on. Would you be interested in me giving a demonstration and a talk to the children? So he was very excited. He brought down the 8th grade science teacher, who was an older gentleman. He was very interested. He told me, come next Friday. And of course, I would have to give the talk 3 different times because there were 3 sections of the 8th grade. I was very excited because I had never I have never taught in kids about that level. And actually, it was interesting to me because I went to an all boys school in Greece, and I didn't think there were any gender issues in the schools because I was only single gender in my school. So I spent the whole week with my undergraduates putting together some good hands-on activities so the children would understand the physics behind the superconductors. And so I had a lot of demonstrations. And here I am, I go to the school that Friday, and I unload everything from the car. And the teacher brought 3 boys to help me take things out of the car. And he told me, these are my science boys. You should talk to them after your talk. I said, sure, that's fine. So here I am giving my talk, and in front of me, in the first lecture, was a little girl with frizzy blonde hair who was glued to everything I had to say. and she was keeping notes. She was very intense. And after my talk, I noticed the teacher, which went pretty well. The students were engaged and they were behaving. So after my talk, I noticed the teacher bringing to me the 3 science boys. That's how he introduced them. The little girl that sees them coming toward me, she gets up, blocks them, and asks me, Dr. Miaoulis, I would like you to help me with my science fair project. Are you willing? Of course, I had not signed up to help anybody with a science fair project. But what do you say to an excited kid that wants to do a project? So I started talking with her. And the teacher comes, pulls me aside, and whispers into my ear, do not waste any time with her. She's not really into science. You should work with my science boys. And that's the moment that pretty much defined my career since then. Of course, I started working with the school. The laboratory conditions were bad, as most laboratories at the middle school level anywhere in the US were. But I was pretty good in getting grants, and I started getting grants from the Parent-Teacher Association. I convinced them that instead of bringing for the 5th time in a row the flamenco dancers, maybe they should buy microscopes for the school, which they did with their funds. And then I started getting state-level grants, and then NSF grants. I ended up getting the Presidential Young Investigator Award. Some of you may remember that. That was $500,000 from NSF to do pretty much whatever you wanted relevant to research and education. So I spent some of that money as well, which was matched by corporations. And within 2 years, the school had probably the best laboratory anywhere in the country for a middle school. So that sort of started my engagement and starting working with a little girl and then getting involved with the school. So what happened then, we were at an age where my young colleagues from the university started having children, and they started being interested in working with the schools in their neighborhood. And so I kept bringing them in to judge science fairs at the school and seeing what we're doing with the laboratory. And slowly, the engineering school at Tufts became one of the most active schools in K-12 science outreach. And it was about 1995, I believe. I was my second year, had become Dean of Engineering at that point at Tufts. And we invited a renowned engineer, Bernie Gordon. Some of you may know Bernie because he's an electrical engineer. Who has 200 patents. Bernie was brilliant, very philanthropic, and kind of difficult guy. So we invited Bernie to ask him to fund the science outreach program. And during our conversation, Chris Rogers, who is now chair of mechanical engineering at Tufts and a colleague of mine since back then, he made the pitch to have Bernie fund our science outreach program. And Bernie got really upset and pretty much left the meeting. And we're wondering what we said that was wrong. And Chris, at some point, said that we want to support science education because science is the field that teaches the young learners how the world around them works. And Bernie said, really, you think that's what science does? And Chris said, yes. And that's what triggered Bernie to leave. So that evening, Chris and I went out to figure out what we said wrong. And we're at a restaurant. And Chris repeated, we said science teaches kids how the world around them works. And I stopped and I said, Chris, just look around you and see how the world around us looks like. Well, everything around us almost everything is human-made. The clothes we wear, the buildings we stand, phones, the computers, everything is human-made. And if you look at what we used to teach in science, this is back in 1995, almost everything was about the natural world, rocks and water and animals, volcanoes. And that's what started sort of the E of STEM at Tufts and pretty much throughout the country. That moment, we decided to start introducing engineering at a very young age, starting in kindergarten, parallel to teaching science, because of course we thought the natural world should also be taught, but also the built world, the engineered world, should be part of the students' learning and life, starting again at a very young age. At the same time, we were very curious of why on earth, with all these brilliant people in technology, in education, in government, engineering was not part of the curriculum. And here is what I found out. Actually, I did some digging. The curriculum, that the traditional science curriculum that was in place in 1995, was decided by the Committee of 10 in 1897, I think. And so President Eliot, US President Eliot at that point, appointed a committee of 10, all men at that point, brilliant guys, to come up with what the science curriculum should have in schools. And the people followed a very rational process. They looked at what science, what things kids learn at home, because kids learn a lot of things at home. They decided what kids should know when they graduate from high school to either go into college or enter workforce. And they filled the gap between what kids learn at home and what they thought should know when they graduated with what is and still is in many ways the science curriculum: biology, chemistry, physics, all these disciplines, focusing on the natural world. Why did they leave the human-made world out? Well, in 1893, I think 93 or 97, I don't remember the year, most kids were growing up in farms. And most engineering was agricultural engineering, was farming engineering, and kids were learning all this stuff at home. So at that point, the committee didn't think it's worth it spending time teaching technology and engineering in schools, because kids were picking up a lot of these things at home. So they focused on the traditional science fields that we still have now. But as technology took off, publishers still were publishing the traditional books, and publishers are not very proactive into changing fundamentally the curriculum and the topics. So as technology took off, the curriculum pretty much stayed the same. And still, in many schools, we spend endless time teaching kids how many legs a grasshopper has, and no time teaching kids how a car works and how glasses are made. So that's what sort of fueled us to really make a push for introducing engineering, the E in what used to be science and math back then, into the curriculum. And that started the whole campaign, because we had to convince teachers, administrators, companies for support, everyone to start thinking differently and thinking that engineering is a valid discipline to be taught starting in kindergarten. And pretty much I had 5 arguments. The first one, that technological literacy is basic literacy. You cannot claim you're a literate citizen if you have no idea how most of the world around you works. So that was sort of the first argument. The second is that engineering is a great integrator. If you think of any discipline that the kids learn in school, there is not a better discipline than engineering to really pull together what they learn in science, in math, in art, in social studies, even to solve real problems. And if you wonder how an engineering project could look in a first grade or second grade, let's say that one of the classrooms has a bunny rabbit as a pet. And the teacher takes care of the bunny rabbit, and of course it's the mascot of the class. And one year, one of the children is allergic to the fur of the bunny rabbit. So an engineering project at that level would be to design and build a habitat for the bunny rabbit that would let the students keep the bunny. On the other hand, making it keep it in a safe way for the student that's allergic to the bunny rabbit. So obviously it would be to build an outdoor habitat for the bunny rabbit, and think of that connects to the classroom, and think of how many things that they learn at that level could be useful in trying to build this habitat. They have to use math to do all sorts of measurements. They have to use science to understand that they need insulation. In Boston, it's cold in the winter, to make sure that heat does not. It's harder for heat to leave the habitat. Even their art skills to make sure that the habitat is attractive enough to fit in the school environment. And that's a simple project, but this could be an engineering project, a problem-solving project for the second grade. So the second argument is engineering is a great integrator and brings to life all the other disciplines that kids may not be interested in because of the way they are taught. The third argument is engineering makes science relevant. And we all know by multiple research projects that relevance is extremely important to keep students interested in science, especially in the middle school grades, and especially girls. Let me tell you sort of what happened with the relevance issue when I was dean at Tufts back in the 90s. I believe I became dean in 1992, 92 or 93. And we used to lose about 25% of our students to liberal arts. So students would come into the engineering school, and about 25% of them would leave. And as a faculty member, I wasn't aware of that. I realized that when I became dean, when deans are the ones that are sort of responsible for retention. And so I immediately called my predecessor, Fred Nelson, and I said, Fred, do you know that we lose about 25% of the students to liberal arts? And he said, yeah, but that's not a problem. Most schools lose about 50%, so we're doing well. Of course, I didn't think that was that was a good answer. So for the first time, I gathered the students into the dean's lounge that had transferred out to ask them why they transferred out. Because I had looked into the transcripts, and at that point, they had all very high SAT scores, over 740 in math, and back then. And also, I looked at the GPA when they moved out, and it was an average of B+. So it was not that they couldn't cut it, couldn't make it. So I gathered them, bought pizza for them, and we had a conversation. And pretty much they told me we transferred out of engineering because we didn't find engineering interesting. What I found interesting is they were transferred out before they had really taken any engineering. You know, maybe they took a drawing course back then, a CAD/CAM course, and maybe a computer programming course, but not really any real engineering. And they were taking math and science, which in many cases they turned the students off, and they simply transferred to liberal arts. So I pulled together some of the most innovative thinkers of our faculty, and we discussed how we could make engineering exciting right early on. And we thought, let's develop exciting engineering courses that stem out of our personal interests and hobbies, and bring it down to the freshman level. And so our passion about engineering. So I went to the National Science Foundation and talked with a couple of program directors. They got very excited about the idea because this was a national and still is problem. And I got some major funding from NSF to develop 12 courses that would be taught the first year. And I needed the funding to convince faculty members to spend part of the summer, along with help from graduate students, to develop the curriculum. So we did, and we had 12 courses from all the departments, developed courses. And the requirement for freshman engineers, first-year engineers, was to take 2 courses, one from 2 different departments. So they would test 2 different kinds of engineering. And these courses were also open to liberal arts students. And after a fierce fight with the liberal arts faculty, I prevailed, and they could count these courses as part of the science requirement for liberal arts. Of course, as a dean, I had to give the good example. So I developed 2 courses. My hobbies is fishing and cooking, and still are. So my fishing-related course was called Life in Moving Fluids. And I used late Steve Vogel's book from Duke. And pretty much was fluid mechanics in the living world. Was why the fish are shaped the way they are, how birds fly, how seeds the Samara seeds are shaped so they can use a helicopter flight to pattern of flight to fly away from the mother tree so they don't fall in the shadow. Very popular course. The second course I developed was gourmet engineering. This was my cooking course. Now, if you think of what you do when you cook, it's primarily you do heat transfer. And so either by conduction, if you put something on a pan, or convection, if you put something in the oven on bake, function, and radiation, if you barbecue something, or if you put something on broil. So you can actually teach an entire heat transfer course under the theme of cooking and the theme of kitchen, and part of thermodynamics for refrigeration as well. So this course was extremely popular. When pre-registration would start, it would fill within the first 3 or 4 minutes. It was crazy. And although the stereotype implied that most of the students that would take this course would be young women, it was primarily populated by young men. And which was sort of interesting to see. And some of the students that registered were pretty good cooks. I had 3 students that had gone to the Cordon Bleu school in Paris and gotten their degree somewhere between high school and college. So the way the course would run is we would have a lecture part, and those of you that come from mechanical or chemical engineering backgrounds and know some heat transfer, you know that trying to solve problems in heat transfer can be very mathematical. For most of the problems, you have to understand differential equations, which the students in the freshman year did not. So I would sort of take them step by step through the math to figure out a heat transfer problem, which could be you have a cylinder with these thermal properties. You place it in it has initial temperature of let's say 70 degrees Fahrenheit, which is room temperature. You put it in an environment of 350 degrees Fahrenheit. How long would it take for the center point of the cylinder to reach 140 degrees? That's a traditional heat transfer problem. So we would do all the math and we would use the charts and would figure out that, let's say, it would get at 140 in about 25 minutes. So then we would go to the laboratory, and the laboratory was a state-of-the-art cooking laboratory. Frigidaire and Kafalon had donated everything, which I had pots and pans in this lab. I could never afford at that point to have at my house. And we would do the experiment, and the experiment would be putting the actual cylinder, which was a roast, with the same dimensions and properties that we used to solve the problem using math. And we would place it in it would be at 70 degrees Fahrenheit, room temperature, and then we would put it in an oven at 350 and put thermocouples in the roast and see how long it would take for the center line to reach 140 degrees. And amazingly, it reached 140 degrees about the same time that the math had predicted. And all of a sudden, math became magical for the students. And they saw the whole point of learning calculus and coming up all the way to differential equations. Chris Rogers, my friend, he was a musician also, and he developed a course of designing a performance of musical instruments. And at the end of each semester, he had to, he was bringing the students to in a dean's lounge typically, and they're all dressed up to give a concert to the musical instruments they would play. And every year the concert looked beautiful and sounded horrible. But it was wonderful to see students using engineering techniques to build musical instruments that actually they could play music. And so we developed, as I said, 12 courses. Eventually, it grew to 40 courses. And first year, we introduced the curriculum. Amazing results. Tufts, at this first year, had more students transferring from liberal arts to engineering than the other way around. And Tufts became, and still is, probably the only school in the country that more students transfer into engineering than out of engineering. So the class grows as it goes on, which shows you how important it is to introduce relevance at all levels, even at the college level, to have students become interested in science and math and continue on to hopefully engineering careers. And if you look at the relevance for girls, if you look at the disciplines, science and engineering disciplines that young women tend to gravitate in college, are biological life sciences, biomedical engineering, environmental engineering, all topics that is evident how they offer value to humans and to animals and to the world. So the third argument was relevance. The fourth one was careers. If you look at the percent of engineers in the United States, and you look at what their parents or relatives' backgrounds are, 72% of engineers have had a relative or a close family friend that was an engineer. Things have changed now by introducing engineering, and I don't know the current numbers now, because now, fortunately, students are learning about engineering in many schools, but we're not there yet where we needed to be. But it pretty much had to have some encouragement from home because you didn't have the encouragement from school. And of course, as we try to diversify the engineering workforce, that's even a bigger problem, because if you look at fields where, let's say, like African Americans, where the young students gravitate, is law, education, and medicine. Engineering has not been a traditional area, although things are improving. And of course, if you don't have the guidance from home, because traditionally parents used to go into these fields, then where do you get your hints? Television, maybe. And if you look at TV programs, only Homer Simpson is the only engineer, I think, that, or somewhat of an engineer, that's still on major network channels. So there was no way for students to get familiar with engineering, get excited by watching TV. MacGyver used to be a show, but that's long time ago. So careers was the fourth argument. And the last argument, the fifth argument, was 3D visualization. That's actually a very interesting thing. When I first became dean, we realized that, and I talked to the folks that were doing the first drawing course back there, paper, pencil, pretty much, and some computing. During the first test of the drawing course, when the students had to visualize things and rotate mentally things in 3 dimensions and draw them, boys were doing better than the girls in the first test. And it was very interesting because boys and girls, or young men, young women at the college level, were coming from the same schools, had same scores. Some of them had same families or had twins. Boys would typically do better than the girls. At the last exam, the final exam, when they had to do the same, there would be no gender difference. So obviously, it wasn't like the boys were better than the girls in doing that. It was something in their preparation from before they came to college. I remember I was actually on jury duty, and I had pulled a lot of papers that jury duty, and if you wait to be picked or not to be picked, there's nothing to do for hours. And I had a stack of papers that were written by different researchers about 3D visualization and gender issues. And one of them was very interesting because it attributed this difference in skill in the toys that boys play compared to toys that girls play as they grow up. So I was very curious. At that point, I had 2 girls, but they were younger, so I wasn't very familiar with sort of the whole toy comparison. So I went to Toys R Us and I spent a couple of hours. It's amazing. If you have an opportunity to go to Target or Toys R Us with a lens of, let's see, the difference in the gender difference of what boys are marketed to play with and girls, you'll be amazed. It's boys' toys is all about 3D visualization and problem solving, like Legos and Kinects and Rector sets and logs, and all about 3D visualization. And girls was all about caretaking. My Little Pony, which is plastic horse with a fuzzy tail with a comb, and Barbie and Barbie's Next Challenge, which actually back then, Barbie's Next Challenge, she was holding a spatula. I don't know what the challenge was. So, obviously, if you have boys playing for 14 years between when they were age they could play with these toys and come to college with all about 3D visualization toys, and girls playing with combing the horse's tail, how do you expect the girls to have the same ability in 3D visualization than the boys? If you introduce engineering starting in kindergarten, which involves design and 3D visualization, then you won't have these differences in boy and girl skills. And actually, this is a skill not only for future engineers and architects. Even if you want to redo your kitchen, you should be able to visualize things in 3 dimensions. It's a human skill. And now, because of everything being in 2 dimensions, or kids are in front of a screen, either playing a video game or doing something on the computer, both boys and girls are losing this ability. There are some computer games that do encourage 3D visualization, although they are into the screens, which is great, but not all kids get exposed to that. So the fifth reason for introducing engineering was to enhance 3D visualization skills for both boys and girls. So I was armed with all these arguments, thinking that we're going to change the world and we're going to convince school systems, the school districts, and states to change the educational system. It was such a difficult task. Started with Massachusetts. And in Massachusetts, the biggest enemy back then, again, it was mid-late 90s, were the science teachers, because they saw it as a threat that's going to take away or pollute the science curriculum. And I'll never forget, I was in a conference, science teacher conference, There were about 600 science teachers in the room. And I was making a similar pitch as I'm making today about introducing engineering into the schools. And in the middle of my talk, one guy gets up and he started yelling. And I really thought that somebody was dying next to him. I didn't know if the place was catching on fire. So I stopped. I said, "Sir, are you okay? What's happening?" He said, "How do you dare, with everything we have to teach, everything in science, we cannot even finish the book in a year. You are throwing one more thing on us to do." And I was curious. I said, "What grade do you teach?" He said, "I teach 6th grade." I said, what field do you teach?" He said, "Earth science." I said, "What do you teach in earth science?" He goes, "Right now." He said, "Volcanoes." I said, "Okay, that sounds good. And how long do you spend teaching kids how a volcano works?" And he goes, "About a month." I said, "And how long do you spend in your school teaching kids how a car works?" He said, "Oh, we don't do that. That's not real science." And I said, well, I asked him, I said, "So how often do your students find themselves in a volcano compared to a car? And why is it more important to spend a month teaching kids how a volcano works and no time giving a basic understanding of when you open the hole in the car and you put this thing with the liquid in, how it makes it run?" Of course, everybody laughed in the room. And I even last year, I saw the guy at the same similar conference, and he still hates me. You know, he turned around and he left. So there was a lot of pushback by the science teachers, some tech ed teachers that were the natural ones to start teaching that stuff also felt threatened because they thought that we're going to bring their field more to the academic level, and then the science teachers would take their jobs. So the science teachers saw it as a threat. Some tech ed teachers saw it as a threat. So it was quite challenging. But nonetheless, Massachusetts in about 2000 became the first state in the country to introduce formally technology and engineering as part of the disciplines that would be tested in the Massachusetts science test. Because as you know, if things are not tested, they're not taught. So at that point, I was still at Tufts. I thought this is wonderful. If Massachusetts did it, now other states will follow. It was even harder because a lot of states would do exactly the opposite that Massachusetts does. So although I was keynote speaker in many conferences, it was not catching on. On the other hand, I had a full-time job being dean of the School of Engineering at Tufts, and I could not spend adequate time to keep doing this. So out of the blue, I got a phone call by a search firm, and he said, "Would you be interested? You're nominated to be president of the Museum of Science in Boston. Would you be interested?" Now, many of you have been probably at the Museum of Sciences Boston. It's one of the best in the world. It's considered in the Ivy Leagues of museums, a very prestigious place, influential place in the museum world. But I never saw myself as a museum person. I love the museum. With my two daughters, we're members. We're going every month, once a month, definitely to the Science Museum. And I love the place, but I didn't think that that was part of my career. I was an academic. I was going to stay in a university. But that evening, I opened the envelope. They sent me a big envelope with a job description, and I looked at it and I thought, this would be a terrific place to use as a platform to push for a national dissemination of engineering in K-12 schools, because the museum primarily is focusing on learners of that age range. It does have influence in DC and all over the world. So I thought a potential strategy would be to start with the museum, introducing engineering inside the museum, and also influencing other museums to have engineering components so that the general public would appreciate what engineering is and what engineering does for society, and at the same time push at the school level. So I dropped my tenure, dropped my position. Everybody was surprised that I would leave Tufts. The Provost Gittleman back there told me that he never thought I would leave at least the dog dies, because all our dogs were named after Tufts buildings. And I went to the museum and immediately started the National Center for Technological Literacy. I brought in some super people from Tufts. Christine Cunningham, who is also one of the speakers, came and joined me at the museum. And we pretty much put the National Center together, which did a number of things. Advocate for the introduction of engineering in schools. So we did a lot of advocacy, developed curricula, and Christine's team developed Engineering as Elementary, which is still the leading curriculum in the world, and still is being used. And the numbers that actually I was introduced with are old numbers. I think by now it's probably 300,000 teachers have been trained, and also over 20 million students. And also did professional development, which was very important. And we did curriculum at the elementary level and middle school level in the beginning. And then we developed a high school curriculum at the same time. And now there's a kindergarten curriculum at the museum and a computer science curriculum that goes along with that. And it's both for in-school activities and out-of-school activities. Again, although things started rolling, when I left the museum about 4 years ago, there was nobody really advocating for engineering into the schools. And actually, Massachusetts, which was the first state to have engineering, dropped engineering as a test for the high school level. Not because people did not value engineering, but simply the principals were putting resources into the areas where they could easily find teachers, like biology. It's much easier to find biology teachers than engineering or physics teachers. And the schools have a choice which high school science test kids should pass in order to graduate. So the easy way was biology and chemistry. It's more difficult to have physics and engineering. So engineering ended up being dropped because there were a lot of resources going into preparing the tests, but only relatively small number of students would take the test. So although we started winning and having a lot of states using the curriculum we developed, getting teachers trained, introducing engineering standards in the curriculum, we started going backwards now. So we do need advocates, and hopefully some of you would be advocates to really push engineering and renew the efforts of introducing engineering in schools all over the place. Now, although the initiative in the beginning was, in my mind, a national initiative, foreign countries are not stupid. So they started being interested in introducing engineering into their countries. So we got visited by a large number of countries interested in our curriculum. And the curriculum, different curricula we developed back then at the museum are now used in Australia, a very successful program in Australia, in Thailand, all over the place. And the other countries are moving into the engineering direction much faster than the United States is moving, although the whole effort started here in the United States, which is unfortunate. So that's pretty much the story of how, from at least my piece of STEM started back in '88, when the little girl asked me to help with her science fair project. And in closing, if you wonder what the little girl did, of course, she won first place at the science fair. She did a lot of great science, a great project around fluid mechanics. And what was wonderful is that girls started winning the science fair. It was a boys' endeavor, the science fair. The boys would do projects like internal combustion engines, and the girls would do projects like dreams and marijuana. It was sort of that usual mix. But by seeing Jenny win the science fair with a spectacular project, the younger girls followed her. And I think for 5 years after Jenny presented her project, girls won the first place in the science fair in the school. And so Jenny left the school. She graduated from middle school. She went into the regional high school. She graduated near the top of her class. And then she went to Haverford College, one of the great liberal arts schools in the country. She studied biology and history. And then she went to Tanzania. And in Tanzania, she started a foundation and a program to introduce science and engineering into the schools in Tanzania. She did her own fundraising. She built fabulous programs in Tanzania. And about 8 years later, she left Tanzania. She went to Stanford University. She got her PhD at Stanford, and now she's a tenured professor at the University of Minnesota. So that was clearly a success story. And if it weren't for Jenny, I probably would have not be here today talking to you about engineering. So I want to thank you for listening to me, and hopefully we'll have time for some questions. What advice would you give to IEEE volunteers delivering STEM? So the first question is, what advice would you give to IEEE volunteers delivering STEM outreach to young students? It's wonderful to have people directly working with students, and I think bringing the human element, like what you are doing in your personal life, makes it more real. I remember at Tufts when my successor, who was a woman in the School of Engineering, developed this great program for students that were interested at Tufts Engineering to engage. And she developed a program where the only girls were invited, or young women were invited to the program. And she would bring in 4 or 5 alums, all women, young alums, that would tell their personal story. And all of a sudden, engineering became so exciting to the prospective students that my own daughter, both of my daughters ended up going to Tufts, both in the mechanical engineering department. That's after I left Tufts, so there was no free tuition at that point. And my older one knew she was going to be an engineer. The younger one was doing pretty much the opposite of what the older one wanted to do. So she said, I'm going to liberal arts. But she went and saw these graduates of the engineering school, engineers, and heard their story. And she came back that day and said, I'm going to be an engineer. It was so influential to her to see engineers that were volunteers to Tufts that told their stories. So connecting the personal life and the excitement to engineering makes all the difference. But also, you could make more of a wholesale influence if you affect your school system, your school committee, into pushing to introduce engineering and have engineering into the system. Because when you give a talk to 20 kids, you influence 20 kids. But if you can change your system, your school district, to have engineering as part of the curriculum, then you can affect thousands and thousands of kids for many years to follow.
Thank you, Dr. Ioannis. There are more questions here. Visualization can even often be a problem in higher education. Can you recommend any book on visualization in science and engineering?
It's not really my expertise, so not really. I would even look at software that games that do promote. There is one which I forget the name now. Is it Mind? I don't remember the name, but it's one that you can build whole cities, and it used to be very popular a few years back. I do not know.
SimCity, probably.
No, it was something else, but I don't recall the name. It was, but it really did encourage players to think in three dimensions.
The next question is, how can we best measure the effectiveness and impact of our programs?
Well, I think there are a number of measures. We had a pretty robust, and still the museum, pretty robust research program to assess the impact of the programs. There are some things that are pretty much easy to measure, and some things that are more difficult to measure. It's looking at numbers. For example, how the numbers of, let's say, young women that continue in engineering increases as you introduce the new program. That's something that we were very focused on. How many students from underrepresented groups became more interested in science because of the program. So that's something that over time you can measure at the school or the after-school program that you're working on. And if the longevity of the program, if your school system continued using the program after you left, that's something that is very tricky with volunteers. As long as a volunteer is on top of it and works with a teacher, many times the program works. And then when the program is handed off to the teacher to do, it sort of falls through the cracks. It helped even with me. It happened with me with the elementary school that I worked with. We developed a wonderful curriculum which used a thematic approach to introduce students from kindergarten to grade 5 to science. And the whole theme was science and engineering in a farm, so in a coastal farm. So we had an aviary, and we had a tidal, simulated tidal pool that we would have sea animals in, and then the kids were exploring physical science and simple machines through bicycles, so things you would find in the farm. The curriculum worked wonderfully for the 6 or 7 years that myself and my graduate students were on top of it in the school. And then when we stopped the program, hoping the teachers would pick it up, it sort of dwindled down and went to nothing. So so this was an effective program as long as we were there as volunteers. But after we left, nobody would follow up. So that's another thing to keep in mind as you volunteer.
Thank you so much. Saira asked about from where I can get curriculum.
So if you go to the Museum of Science, mos.org website, or EIE.org, engineeringiselementary.org, you can see a ton of things about the curriculum, how it's implemented, success in the classroom. And right now, I'm president emeritus of the museum. I don't have any formal affiliation other than my title with the museum. But there's a very good website. You can get all this information.
I think we have more questions. Would you please give some advice for pre-university students on how to be effective and impactful in promoting whether our campaign or any cause or ourselves?
Pre-university. Well, at pre-university, university students would be great mentors, engineering students in particular, for pre-university students. Again, at Tufts, we had a very robust program, and it still exists, to encourage engineering students to work with students, to encourage them to engage in engineering. Actually, my younger daughter, the one that was convinced to go into engineering after that orientation, she started as an engineer. She worked 3 years as an engineer, but because of her involvement with the K-12 program we had at Tufts, 3 years later, she went on her own, got her master's in education, and now she's teaching math in an inner city school in Boston. So it also had a great impact in her life. Now, pre-university students could work with teachers and parents to try to influence again the introduction of engineering in their classroom and in the system. I think that's the most effective way to go toward it. Also, if your high school students could be great mentors to younger students. So if there is an elementary engineering program being taught at the school district, it would be great if pre-university students, high school students, could be helpers of the teacher into doing all the hands-on activities and encouraging students. Students get much more influenced by younger people, close to their age, than by older people. So that's another way that pre-university students could help out.
Thank you so much. Another question: what we can do to convince parents that STEM activities are not just games, but there is a whole educational outcome?
Well, the 5 arguments I gave you are sort of answer that question. It's the technological literacy, make things relevant. STEM integrates a lot of the things that students learn aside of math and science. Potential introduction to careers in engineering, which are very wonderful careers for somebody to follow. 3D, these are all arguments that could be used. Now, one of the challenges is when the whole STEM started catching on, in the beginning was SEM. It was science, engineering, and math when we started. Then the computer folks, the computer teachers started wanting to jump in the bandwagon along with some technology teachers. And that's how the T came along. And everybody was seeing now technology teachers, tech ed teachers, from being in the basement and doing car mechanics for the curriculum, all of a sudden they became valid players in the whole STEM ecosystem. So then the arts teachers that were losing their jobs at that point started jumping in, and they wanted to be part of that. And that's how STEAM came along. So actually there was about 1.5 years that half of the people who would invite me, half the conference would invite me to be a speaker, were arts conferences, because they wanted to do with arts what we did with engineering. So that's why you see STEAM now as part of it. I think the 5 arguments, though, I gave would justify why STEM could be part of the curriculum, particularly engineering.
Thank you. How do you address the shortened attention span of kinders using tech, such as Tinkercad? Any products or methods you suggest?
To be honest with you, I have left the whole effort. I left 4 years ago to come to the university, and I have not followed up. So I would not be a good one to give you state-of-the-art information. But Christine, that is going to be a speaker in the upcoming days. She may be able to. I'm sure I know she's more up to speed than I am on all this stuff.
Thank you. How do we really know that what we are doing as a STEM ambassador has any long-term lasting impact?
Well, the numbers. Numbers speak for themselves. So when we started this whole engineering effort, we looked at, there's I think every other year, the National Academy of Engineering, I believe, I'm not sure about that, but they have a survey where they survey fathers of what you would recommend for your daughter to study, and it was science or engineering. Year after year, it was science. Once we started this effort, we started shifting, and now it's engineering. So it's a whole public perception about what students should study has very much improved into favoring engineering, especially for encouraging young women to go to engineering. So looking at how numbers shift, numbers of students interested in engineering, a lot of that has to do with economy that drives students to study one thing or another. A lot of it has to do with television and games and social media. But of course, if you have a program, you can see how numbers have changed, how attitude of students have changed, how much these programs have attracted members that used to be underrepresented in the field, how these numbers have changed.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ioannis. Another question, any advice or guidance for teachers or parents?
Well, the nice thing is that now there is a lot of material that teachers could use, and it's easy to use. Teachers could get trained in just a few days, and parents could be supporting this whole movement of introducing other elements into the kids' learning other than science, the traditional science and math. So parents could be volunteer, could be influential in the school committees or in the private schools. So teachers could start teaching it, but then they need to have the support of their school system and the principals, or parents could keep pushing to introduce this curricula into the schools.
Yes, and you can also explore triangulated.org, developed by IEEE, where you can also find some resources that you can use. Dr. Ioannis, I think this is it for it. Thank you so much for this inspiring talk. I think that you have gave us valuable information to all of us. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you all for connecting to this talk.
Thank you.
Well, just to finish, please remember that we will have more sessions today. At noon, we will have our Triangulating Tuesday session that is called 5G, 6G, and the Metaverse, a Silicon Valley view. Then at 4 p.m., we will have Dr. Elizabeth Alves talking about pedagogy to practice with your neurodiverse STEM students. And last, at 7 p.m., Josh Borker will talk about Free Your Mind and Your Class Will Follow. And of course, more sessions will come tomorrow. Please stay online and join us in all the sessions. Have a great rest of the day.